Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm the opposite side to what I normally am. That is because if I'm over here, I'm entirely in sunlight and there's nothing I can do about it. Anyway, that aside, this feels, mixing it up a little, really showing the judges some versatility here. And today I'm talking about another book, a long-listed book, and that is A Town Called Solace by Mary Lawson. And so this book is all about, essentially, ostensibly at the heart of it is a story about a girl who goes missing and the family sort of rallying around to try and find out more information. Now, again, before, like with the other Booker reviews, before I go into a bit more detail, I just wanted to let you know I will be going into spoilers later, but I will also be telling you when that comes up. So let's go from there. But yeah, by all means, if you need to duck out before I get to spoiler territory, totally fine. Feel free to come back once you've read the book. And so I guess really at the heart of it, this book is it's sort of dealing with the fallout in this family. There's someone called Clara, which is entertaining, with there also being Clara and the Sun on the long list. For me at least, for literally nobody else. But essentially, A Town Called Solace really digs into this idea. So apart from the fact that every time I hear the title, A Town Called Solace, my first reaction is to kind of go like, oh yeah, under my breath because of that song. The whole idea is there is actually a town that is named Solace. I thought this was just going to be sort of like a joke or a reference or some kind of literary thing. No, there's actually a place called Solace in Canada, and that's where we have a lot of this story taking place. So I thought it was quite an interesting one. I will say, kind of right off the bat, not my favourite on this Booker long list. I don't think it's bad per se. I was just quite surprised actually because I sort of, as I started reading it, I thought, okay, this is sort of interesting. I really loved this opening, which is this sort of quite murky, quite difficult situation as we find out a little bit about the girl having gone missing. And there are these sort of beautiful moments very early on. So this is not a spoiler. This will literally come up in the first chapter, where characters are looking out of the window. Well, the sister is looking out of the window, waiting for her sister, the missing one, to come back. And it's told in this really beautiful, interesting way that I just thought was so stunningly done to start us off. But unfortunately for me, the rest of the book never quite got to the rest of, like, kind of never really quite kept up that same pace. Again, I am perfectly willing to kind of accept that it may well be a very much me problem. I was sort of tired and maybe a bit sleepy and whatever when I was trying to read this. So maybe there's a little bit of that. And maybe by this point I was just sort of having Booker fatigue, I don't know. But, sort of not being able to choose my own reading quite as much, and sort of little stubborn kind of anger about that. But I mean, I do think there are some really interesting things that this book pulls on. So it pulls on a lot of themes around this idea of small town Canada, these themes around this family really trying to work out what happens. And I think it does do something quite interesting there about really observing how different family members take this news and how they sort of dissect and take on parts of it. I think I just wanted a little bit more punch to this book, as in I think it sort of starts on this really sort of interesting way, and then for me, yeah, I don't know, it's also told across sort of several different narratives, and I realise this is now turning into a theme of mine, that I have a real issue with sort of multiple narratives, unless it's literally 2 or maybe 3. I mean, this book has 3, but I don't know if it needed the 3rd, essentially, is my feeling on that. I kind of think that having 2 would have maybe been enough to kind of have this sort of alternating sort of narrative and keep up the tension, whereas I think in some ways part of the tension was lost for me over the book because it's split into sort of multiple people talking about sort of various incidents in various parts of the story. However, I will say, there is something so appealing about small town tales and something so interesting about hearing these very sort of specific stories that are very tightly done and tightly woven and kind of told. I don't know if this was necessarily the book for me though, as part of that. And from that, I'm going to go a little bit into spoiler territory. You have been warned, we are about to go there. If you would like to read the book and then kind of check back afterwards, please do. I would love to hear your thoughts. But apart from that, we are about to go into the spoilers. And so in some ways, I say spoiler alert on some of this. Part of me does feel like the plot is fairly conventional in some ways. A girl goes missing, and as a result, we kind of see a lot of the things that we'd probably expect to see in a story about a girl going missing. You know, it follows. It's not a particularly new story, and I don't mean that as an insult to Mary Lawson. I think she does tell it pretty well. I just don't think that this is necessarily going to be that groundbreaking for many people who might read, for example, Anne Tyler, or you know, it fits into sort of common molds. And I think Anne Tyler is a comparison that I kept on feeling throughout the book. And I have to admit, as much as I hate comparing authors in a sense, I kind of found myself doing that quite a lot with this book, of sort of saying it feels like an Anne Tyler book to me. And that is not an insult. Anne Tyler is a wonderful writer, but she does tend to write sort of family dramas set in small towns with characters who it's all sort of tightly woven around sort of central things happening. The characters respond in quite predictable ways often, and it's quite comforting reading. And again, none of that is an insult. I don't mean that to suggest that she's less literary or whatever, but I think this was the problem I then had, because I sort of was easing into it in a kind of Anne Tyler novel way, and then found that it just didn't, it lacks some of the warmth and some of the joy that I often find in Anne Tyler books. And again, maybe that's unfair to compare two authors in that sense, and to judge an author for not being another author. That does seem unfair, and I try to sort of read it without those sort of glasses on. I did actually have my glasses off because I read better that way. That's irrelevant. But I tried to kind of take that out of the equation, and unfortunately I think I still just sort of wasn't necessarily wowed by parts of the story. Again, this is not to suggest she's a bad writer. I think it is done really well, especially in some parts. And we get this moment towards the end where the sisters are reunited, and that I think is done really quite beautifully. Although for me the book then kind of ends kind of quite quickly. We have a lot that's hinted to us about the fact that we are told that basically this girl who has been away essentially has been sort of trafficked or abused, and it's only sort of in the town she's only sort of been noticeable because she had short hair, and all of these sorts of things thread in. You know, we have these family members who feel guilt because by certain actions, by not telling someone a certain bit of information, or by saying something else, or by overreacting or underreacting or whatever, this character has felt pushed away, and so has the other sister. And as a result, you know, it's all sort of wrapped up in this small town drama of characters. You know, it's sort of someone's friend, sister's cousin, friend at school's thing, you know, where it's sort of very word of mouth. And at one point there's this sort of reference to the idea that to pass on a bit of information about something is going to take 2 days. And then another character suggests actually maybe closer to 3 days, because the first character is going to have to think about it for a while, sort of sit on it for a day, then pass this knowledge on sort of through the grapevine, through someone at school who'll then pass it on to their sibling, and then pass on to someone else. And through that, the information will be shared. And I thought that was really well handled. I thought that felt very much like I don't think I've ever really lived in a very small town, but that felt very small town sort of vibes kind of coming from it, for want of a better word. And so yeah, I could really get on board with that. And we have this really heavy hinting that essentially what's happened is with you know, following this abuse, that we understand that there's going to be this tension between the two sisters, where as much as they're both going to be delighted to see each other again, there is something unspoken and unknown between the two of them. And I have to admit, part of, not to kind of put the characters through more pain, but I actually think it would have been really interesting to have that in the book a bit more, because actually we're talking about a sort of teenage sister, and one who's I think 8 years old, I want to say. And the dynamic of those two sisters kind of communicating that across an age gap and across an understanding gap, I think would have been really interesting, of how one character talks to the other about it, how they reassure each other, how they look after each other, all of those sorts of things. And I almost felt a little bit cheated by the fact that we didn't have that in the book. Instead, characters sort of refer to it, and they say, for example, oh, you know, those two sisters are going to have to it's going to be a bit difficult when they first sort of see each other again, or they're going to be happy to see each other, but maybe this will come up, and they won't know how to deal with it. And that is interesting in itself, but I kind of wanted that to also be shown. Again, I don't know if that's putting the characters through too much pain to have all of that on page, on the page, especially as so much of the novel obscures those sorts of details, that we know that she has gone missing, but we also don't know what's happened to her, and then it's only really ever alluded to. We never hear that from the character's mouth herself. We never really hear it too directly. We kind of hear it only really as background information, which again fits that small town feel, right? That's very small town to maybe only have a sort of whiff of an answer as opposed to the real thing from the person themselves. So I thought that was interesting, but for me it still sort of, I think I got to the end of the novel and sort of had a bit of a okay, so what moment of, we've been through this little journey, something's happened, there have been some really interesting moments, but I kind of wanted something else. There is this side plot as well through kind of various characters, and this sort of older character who we are sort of hearing from on her hospital bed, in many ways, and we hear that, and that was really moving, but sometimes for me felt a tiny bit disconnected. I get why it was there, and I think it did balance out the rest of the story quite nicely, and it sort of channeled that idea of a sort of family tree, things passing through a family tree, and sort of pains and insecurities and things sort of passing down the line, particularly in a small town, and particularly around secrets and all those sorts of things. And that was interesting. I kind of just feel like I wanted the novel to kind of go for the jugular a little bit more and really dig into some of these uncomfortable things within the book. I respect Mary Lawson's choice to not do that, and to kind of leave that unsaid. I fully respect that. I think maybe just me as a reader, I maybe thought that there was a missed opportunity there, although I perhaps get the reasons for why that was. Anyway, so that was Mary Lawson's A Town Called Solace. Ooh, yeah. And if you have any thoughts or opinions about this book, I'd love to hear them. I know that some people have really loved this book and really gotten on with it. Some people less so. So I'd be keen to hear some other thoughts. Are there any things I've missed? Almost definitely there are. Yeah, take care and speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.